He became the stark, imposing figure universally known as Il Duce. Benito Mussolini actually kicked off his career on the exact opposite end of the political spectrum. Believe it or not, in his early years he was this intense, highly charismatic socialist and the firebrand editor of the newspaper Avanti. He was out there vocally championing the working class. But his worldview took a massive sudden right turn when World War I broke out in Europe. He totally broke with his party's neutral stance and aggressively advocated for Italy to join the fight. And that ideological pivot, yeah, it got him immediately expelled from the Socialist Party. Unfazed, in 1915, he put his brand-new, ultranationalist, militant beliefs right into action and actually enlisted in the Italian army to fight in the trenches.
From there, his climb to absolute power was terrifyingly swift. After recovering from a severe explosion injury during a military exercise in 1917, Mussolini returned to an Italy that was politically fractured and economically on the ropes. The country was basically begging for radical change, and he completely capitalized on that chaos. By 1919, he rapidly built momentum by founding a militant movement made up of fiercely loyal nationalists and disillusioned ex-soldiers. You probably know them as the Blackshirts. And they weren't just a political party, they were literally a private paramilitary force. By October 1922, he used this private army to orchestrate the infamous March on Rome. Faced with tens of thousands of armed fascists descending on the capital, the king actually refused to declare martial law, terrified of a civil war, and just handed the government over to Mussolini. Once his foot was in the door, it was game over. By 1925, he had completely dismantled whatever fragile remnants of democracy Italy had left, officially declaring himself the absolute dictator.
To lock in that iron grip on the nation, Mussolini meticulously engineered a massive cult of personality. He heavily leveraged art, film, and inescapable propaganda campaigns because he deeply understood the profound power of imagery. Instead of just looking like a standard politician or prime minister, he portrayed himself as this triumphant, unyielding aviator soaring over the Colosseum, or as a modern emperor destined to restore the long-lost glory of ancient Rome. Whether he was famously ripping his shirt off in freezing temperatures to flex his physical prowess for the cameras, or striking those super-rigid, chin-jutting poses up on his balcony in Piazza Venezia, the whole thing was deliberately designed to project an aura of absolute, unquestionable strength to the Italian people.
And you know, that intense projection of invincibility was frequently and sometimes violently put to the test. He famously dropped the totally defiant phrase, "Bullets pass, but Mussolini remains," right before heading off on a trip to Libya. He was projecting this immortal, godlike strength just after surviving a crazy assassination attempt on April 7, 1926. An Irish aristocrat named Violet Gibson walked right up to him in Rome and shot at him at point-blank range. But get this, in a twist of incredible dramatic irony, he happened to tilt his head back to acknowledge the crowd at the exact millisecond she pulled the trigger, so the bullet just grazed the bridge of his nose. Bleeding but completely undeterred, he just slapped a bandage on his face and expertly spun that near-death experience to make his untouchable mythos even bigger.
But here's the thing. Beneath this shiny, meticulously crafted illusion of state-controlled radio broadcasts and massive posters endlessly shouting that Mussolini is always right, lay a deeply terrifying reality. The glorious facade masked a brutal police state built entirely on the violent, systematic suppression of all political opposition. A glaring, truly tragic example of this was the fate of the courageous socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti. In 1924, Matteotti bravely stood up in the Italian parliament and openly called out widespread fascist election fraud and violence. He absolutely knew the risks, but he spoke up anyway. Just days later, Matteotti was kidnapped in broad daylight and brutally murdered by fascist thugs. His death sent a chilling, undeniable signal to all of Italy. Any dissent, any questioning of Il Duce would be met with swift and absolute violence.
That kind of absolute, unchecked power breeds incredibly dangerous ambitions. In May 1939, Mussolini made a fatal calculation that would ultimately doom his regime and his country. He formalized the so-called Pact of Steel with Adolf Hitler. This sweeping agreement officially chained his fascist state to Nazi Germany, committing each nation to unconditionally support the other if a war broke out. And this was a massive gamble. Despite knowing full well from his top generals that Italy was militarily, industrially, and economically entirely unprepared for a major long-term conflict, Mussolini's ego just drove him blindly forward. Convinced that a swift Axis victory across Europe would score him vast new territories in the Mediterranean and Africa, he plunged Italy headfirst into World War II by June 1940.
Well, those grand imperial dreams almost immediately turned into devastating military nightmares. His campaigns were, frankly, disastrously poorly planned, severely under-resourced, and led by officers who were chosen for their loyalty instead of their actual competence. In October 1940, eager to prove his military might to Hitler, he launched this totally unprovoked invasion of Greece, and it ended in a humiliating, chaotic retreat that stunned the world. At the exact same time, his forces were facing massive, utterly crushing defeats against the British in North Africa. In both major theaters of war, the supposedly mighty Italian army just crumbled. Ultimately, a profoundly humiliated Mussolini was reduced to literally pleading with the German military to step in and save his collapsing forces. The fatal blow to his prestige and his grip on Italy hit in July 1943 when massive Allied forces successfully invaded the Italian island of Sicily, bringing the war directly to his front door.
The climax of his downfall arrived with breathtaking speed that summer, as the Allies relentlessly bombed Rome itself and pushed their steady, bloody advance through Sicily. The internal pressure within the fascist government became absolutely unbearable. Late into the night on July 24, 1943, in a highly dramatic meeting, his own Grand Council of Fascism, literally the very men who had propped him up for decades, turned against him and voted to strip him of his military command. The very next afternoon, the king officially dismissed him from office. In a staggering, totally unprecedented fall from grace, the once all-powerful dictator who had ruled with an iron fist for 20 years was arrested right on the steps of the royal palace. They quietly hauled him away in the back of a Red Cross ambulance, which was a deliberate move to completely avoid any public unrest or rescue attempts.
But the story takes a bizarre, almost cinematic twist here. Just weeks later, in September 1943, elite German commandos, arriving silently from the sky in gliders, led by the infamous Otto Skrzynyi, pulled off a daring, heavily armed rescue mission. They snatched Mussolini from a high-altitude ski resort operating as a mountain prison at Gran Sasso. Taking his Italian guards completely by surprise, they flew him straight to Germany to meet with Hitler. But this rescue wasn't a triumphant return to power. It was a huge demotion. Hitler installed a now frail, heavily medicated, and greatly diminished Mussolini as the head of the Italian Social Republic, which was really nothing more than a puppet state set up in northern Italy, completely propped up by the presence of German troops and totally controlled by the Nazi high command.
By April 1945, the situation in Europe was just utterly hopeless for the Axis powers. As the Allied forces finally shattered the last remaining defensive lines in the mountains, and incredibly brave anti-fascist partisans rose up to liberate major northern cities like Milan and Turin, Mussolini's remaining illusion of power completely evaporated. The man who once promised to recreate the Roman Empire was now a terrified fugitive in his own country. Knowing the absolute end was near, and terrified of falling into the hands of the very people he had oppressed, a deeply desperate Mussolini attempted to flee over the Alps to neutral Switzerland. He hitched a ride with a retreating German anti-aircraft convoy, hiding in the cramped back of a transport truck. In this really pathetic contrast to the bare-chested, proud emperor he used to play, he disguised himself by wearing an oversized German non-commissioned officer's overcoat and pulling a heavy steel helmet way down over his eyes, just hoping to slip away unnoticed in all the chaos.
Yeah, it didn't work. During a routine checkpoint stop in the small village of Dongo near the Swiss border, a local Italian partisan peered into the back of the truck and instantly recognized the former dictator's distinctive profile. He was swiftly captured. Fearing a last-minute German rescue attempt or a lengthy, complicated public trial, the partisan leadership acted decisively. On the morning of April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini and his fiercely loyal mistress, Clara Petacci, who had refused to leave his side, were executed by a firing squad against a low stone wall. In a final, brutal, and highly symbolic manifestation of the regime's total collapse, their bodies were transported to Milan and publicly displayed, hung upside down from the roof of a gas station at Piazzale Loreto. And chillingly, this was the exact spot where fascist death squads had executed a group of innocent partisans and left them in the street just a year prior.
That execution at Piazzale Loreto marked the definitive, grim end to 20 years of fascist rule in Italy, closing the book on a man who built an empire on violence and massive propaganda, only to see it completely and utterly destroyed by his own hubris. Now, I turn it over to you. What do you think about this war? What impact did it have on the world? Let's discuss in the comments.